I will start now. So welcome everyone to the fourth session of the Africa Oxbridge Dialogues of 2020. So for the benefit of the recording, I will repeat what most of you probably already know. So this is a collaboration between African and African Diaspora students of Cambridge University and the University of Oxford. The session today is titled This House Believes the New Colonialism is Technology. So technology is a broad field, and there are many things one could think of or talk about, even in the African context. So that is why we'd like to narrow it down so that the interaction can be as constructive as possible. So within the field of technology, with a particular focus on the recent innovations, we like to explore issues of ownerships and investments, namely who owns the technologies and businesses in the continent, who is investing in them. We like to look at issues of data consumption, exploitation, and discrimination. So who owns and who controls the data that is produced and consumed in Africa? Are Africans and African initiatives discriminated against in the internet, for example? We'd like to also look at issues of gender and regional divide. So is there a division in that sense in the drivers of technological innovation in Africa? If so, why? And if so, what can be done to rectify pre-existing issues? And all of these three major questions, we'd like to think about them within an even bigger question, which is, will technological development necessarily result in a better Africa? Or is it possible that inequalities will continue even in a futuristic society? We have 4 speakers to open the reflections today, and an invited guest from Kenya, currently studying in Rwanda, which we will introduce one at a time next. We'll have to excuse, I think the competition is very skewed, like both, I guess, both regionally and also gender-wise. This is partially because, fortunately, 2 of the speakers that had registered dropped out a few days ago, and we have not managed to find replacements. We hope that everyone, as in half of the time of the session, would be reserved for open discussion. So we hope to be able to investigate or debate some of those issues with all the participants. So, if there are no questions, I will introduce the first speaker, Richmond Herwey, who is a current PhD student at the University of Cambridge. Postdocs. So please go ahead, Richmond. You have to unmute yourself.
Point of correction, I'm not a PhD student, I'm a doctor. So that's very important. Yeah, as I mentioned, I would like to share some few slides. I'll run through them quickly so that I don't take much of the time, because most of the arguments I want to make, it's in the slides, so I think that it will help. So if the host can enable me to share my slides, that would be helpful.
Yes, you should be able to try.
Good. Thank you. So, can you all see my screen now?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much for this interesting debate proposition. So information technology as the new colonialism, I think in itself is a very interesting topic. And in thinking about this or in preparing, these were some of the things that came through my mind. How does this information technology ecosystem currently look like? And how can it become a new form of colonialism? who is or who are the colonizers. If you are relating this to colonization, then you need to understand who the colonizers are, the colonized people, the colonies or the territories in question, the domains of colonization. What arguments are advanced in framing and diffusing this form of colonization, and what is the nature of the power dynamics and the forms of vulnerabilities in this form of colonialism, and possibly what can we do about it? I don't necessarily hope to be able to answer all these questions in this short period, but I hope to be able to set some agenda in motion that can also facilitate our conversation. So the technology, as you mentioned, or information technology, it's a very contested concept and it's very broad indeed. You can look at it from different perspectives, but just for this conversation, just to point to the fact that if you talk about technology, it can mean so many things and it can mean nothing. So things that you can direct your minds to, the cloud services and the providers, telecommunication network providers, hardware and software. These are the things you can quickly see in the ecosystem of technology. And then the concept of colonialism, of course, from our experience as Africans, and I believe what we have been taught, we've learned. We had a colonial master. So we are trying to relate this concept to technology, and that will mean that we need to understand in this landscape who will be the colonial master or the colonizer. Is this going to be a country like, for example, Ghana was first colonized by the Portuguese and later on by the Dutch and then the British? So is it going to be a country? Is it going to be a company? Is it going to be an individual? The colonized, I believe our country was colonized, the people and everything that pertains to it. Is it the same thing you're going to see? Are people going to be colonized? Is it our businesses? Is it our institutions? The colony. So we have protectorates, we have colonies, we have regions that were colonized. Can we think around this within this digital or technology ecosystem? Is it going to be at the global level, at the regional level, national and local? And the domains, are we looking at it from just one specific aspect of our life, or this thing is going to invade every aspect of our life? And how is it framed? Is it framed as we being users of this form of colonization? Are we consumers? All these, I think, are very important issues. So I take a stand, as in having mentioned that we've got a very wide spectrum of areas to look at. For me, I want to focus more on data. And why do I say data? I think that currently it's estimated that the global value of big data, it's somewhere around the value of $90 billion. And as in, of course, depending on who you are reading from, this figure can go up to about $110 billion. And for me, this is very important. And data in itself comes in different forms. So we have data velocity, data volume, data variety. What I want us to direct our minds to is the variety of data. Sometimes we talk about data and we think that, well, maybe data is the hard evidence you have or something, but these are different types of data sets that I believe that forms that scope or that arena where if you want to think about colonization, it will take place, that arena. So all these from SMS, audio, videos, Skype, the Zoom conversation, all these are forms of data we are generating. So I just wanted to use my own case to sort of give you a sense of how this form of colonization is going to sort of come about. So this is my Instagram profile. And I was just looking at just this aspect of it. So if I ask you, you don't know me from anywhere, but you visit my profile and then you see this, I believe that even without using any algorithm or anything, you can begin to form a profile or a thought about who I am. And it can range from anything, but just to point something out to you, from this you can tell what I'm likely to read or write about, who I'm likely to collaborate with, my mode of transport, and possibly my sense of security. You can see probably my sense of fashion. And this is just to tell you, this is just data from one social media platform, that is Instagram, and just one type of data, photo. So you can imagine if you scale this up to maybe a national or a sub-national level, and I'm using the case of Ghana as an example, where you have national census reports, data on national census, from national census, think about universities, examination records, scores, entries, infrastructure scorecards in different countries, companies in countries, their tax information, national identification registries, and all these different sorts of data. And this, if I go back to this slide, we are talking about different volumes of data. So we've moved away from just gigabytes, terabytes. We are talking about petabytes and exabytes of data, large sizes of data. So then it comes in who are going to sort of, we think around who are the beneficiaries, who are going to make the gains. And this data shows that we've got these 5 major companies worldwide who control about 80.9% of the market share of cloud services. And I believe with the large streams of data that is coming, if you happen to be among these top 5 companies, you stand a better self. Having some control, some form of agency, some form of power, some form of dominance in this landscape. I won't bore you with all the details, but we can talk about this later. So this is the Global Cybersecurity Index. And if you talk about these large volumes of data coming, and I believe that in thinking around colonization and other related issues, we need to also think about what are the vulnerabilities that these volumes of data, everything centered around data, what sort of risks it presents. So just this data from the International Telecommunication Union regarding Global Cybersecurity Index. And I was just fascinated when I look at Africa. Unfortunately, the skills didn't appear, but it just tells you that if the countries that are very light blue are those countries that have very good systems of cybersecurity. And in Africa, you can literally count countries that seem to be doing well. And for me, that was quite instructive. And if you break it down to the individual countries, in Africa, these are the top 3 countries that seem to be doing well on the Global Cybersecurity Index, and 5 main areas that is considered in this report. I may not be able to go through that, but it just gives you a sense of, you can just look at the score, the differences in the score, to give you a sense of the disparities between countries. And this data set on global data protection regulation. Countries that have very good data protection, countries that are very heavy, modest, robust, and limited. And most parts of West Africa, Northern Africa, and even Central Africa, it's either we don't have data on them or they have very weak sort of data protection. You can only see Ghana, Nigeria, I think Angola, and some South Africa, countries that really have a representation when it comes to cybersecurity, which is a very important aspect of data. So some insight, this is data about broadband, fixed broadband subscription per 100 inhabitants across the world. As we go through time, you realize that we are still at a very bottom. As in we have less than maybe 3 people per 100 inhabitants who have access to broadband subscriptions. And that is quite insightful if you look at what does it mean if you are thinking about it in terms of market. But already something interesting is happening across the African continent. So you look at the emergence of Africa's new cities, and you can begin to see the rate at which we are getting new cities across, and new cities are cities that have been built from the scratch. The dots with the purple colors are all new cities that are spreading across Africa. And
which one? Sorry to disturb you, but just say we have 1 minute left.
All right, that's fine. All right. So let me just wrap up. Mobile phone adoption rates in Africa. That's data from 2000. And just look at sub-Saharan Africa. Averagely, we have around 63% of our population having access to a mobile phone. If you think about internet adoption, we have just about 10% at the national level compared to other countries like high-income countries, Latin America, Asia, and all that. I think in your introduction, you mentioned something about gender inequalities in terms of digital technology uptake, rural urban. We can clearly see these divides, these inequalities still will be playing out even in this data landscape. So what can we do? What can we do about this? I think you probably expect that I will take a position, but I think that the devil is in the detail. But I think what we can do, fortunately, Africa is full of sovereign states with laws. So let's review our laws and make sure we take relevant aspects that will help this digital economy. Leaders should be well informed. I believe that one of the things that African youth, with our demographic dividend, one of the things we'll benefit from is to be able to educate ourselves to understand what data is. As in, it's not just enough to have a smartphone and have a social media account, but to know that any click, any tap, any share creates data, which can either empower somebody or put you down. So I'll just stop here so that my co-panelists can also have their say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richmond. I think you gave us a very good kind of like a starting position to think about the issue of the data itself, where it flows, where it comes from, where it goes to, and who that is benefiting. We will move, without further ado, move to the second panelist, David Izogu, who is let me get it right this time. So David is a PhD in theory and computational chemistry in Cambridge from Nigeria. Please go ahead. You are muted.
It's myself. Okay, so thank you guys for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and trying to share my view on the topic. But I think before I say anything, all I'm going to do now is just to kind of set the stage for subsequent discussion when possibly those who are listening are going to come in with questions, and then the panelists will be taking up at them. So, but before I do that, I would like to take a stand, like I said. My stand is that colonialism has never ended in Africa. And to do that, I will first of all try to quote the British Prime Minister, Boris, who said that the problem wasn't that Africa was colonized by the British, but the problem was that the British left. So if you ask me, the presence, the physical being of the British might have left Africa and other Europeans that colonized Africa, but Africa is still being colonized. So I would like to first of all draw attention to the antecedents of the exploitative violence of colonialism in Africa, which actually started with a crusade, the colonization of Americans, and then the ensuing slave trade. So the crusade was actually propagated by material greed, cultural domination, religion, racism, which was used to justify the pillage and massacre of non-Europeans, right? Then the slave trade depopulated the African continent as a whole and cost it its young and productive members, coupled with the derail of political history and economical development. Now, the colonial masters reaped more than economic benefits from slavery. They fed the people, their own people, their population increased with new wealth and industry. They developed better technology with which they further conquer and exploit the rest of the world. So some people might have actually argued that slave trade actually ended because it was no longer economically productive following Industrial Revolution. Now, the slave trade ended in the 1980s, in the early 19th century, but the pursuit of profit, racism, and self-aggrandizement did not end. Instead, it grew more with the development of industries that required more raw materials, cheap labor, and markets for the manufactured goods. So in an attempt to look for this market for manufactured goods, the colonial masters, what did they do? They initiated the classical colonization in Africa, in which the colonial masters held populations captive in their own land, forcing them to serve the same economic, racial, and self-aggrandizement that actually gave rise to and sustained the Atlantic slave trade that we all know about. So like the colonization of the Americans and the Atlantic slave trade, it was systemic violence. It was organized, continuous, methodic, and willful. So the demise of classical colonization, which was the inception of colonization itself in Africa, started in 1957 when Ghana got their independence. And then later on, other African countries followed in the 1960s and 70s. But this independence from the classical colonization ushered in the neocolonialism, which sees the masters returning through the back door to control political and economic power. And the African elites who took over power from the colonial masters merely replaced them and continued with their ways. They didn't make things better. So today, to be honest, we still experience neocolonialism going on in Africa. So this brings us to the latest stage of colonialism, which I will call meta-colonialism, which is simply the colonial system that goes beyond in scope and behind in depth what classical colonialism and neocolonialism has achieved. So it presents itself in the form of globalization. But the questions that remains unanswered are who actually benefits from this new craze and who suffers because of its global effect. So there are whole people who kind of argue for globalization, and those people find the answers directly by looking at the importance and whatever it is that globalization has made life for us. But we find the answer not directly in the words of those that promote globalization, right? But specifically, the meta-colonization that we're talking about emanates from the same geography and society as did Atlantic slave trade, classical colonization, and neocolonialism, right? So for the meta-colonization, which is actually all about the role that the information technology has to play in the whole of this, the motives remains the same, all the way from the classical colonization, from neocolonialism, and to the present latest colonialism, which is the meta-colonization. The motive remains the same. What has changed is simple, the tactics. Now let's look at the information technology we are talking about and just look at the effects. There are 54 countries in Africa. And of these 54 countries in Africa, we have a population of roughly 1.3 billion people with a total GDP of 2.5 trillion and annual growth of 3.7%. This is an entire continent, the whole Africa that we're talking about. But now look at the people who control the information technology around the world. The same masters out there. Apple and Microsoft, the market capital of Apple alone is 1.9 trillion US dollars. And that of Microsoft is 1.6 trillion US dollars. Now, two companies alone has a market capital that is more than the gross domestic product of the entire continent made up of 54 countries. So it's obvious for you who controls, who owns what you're doing. So despite the fact that people might begin to look at it as the fact that we have a better life today, that is not enough. And so I think my time might be up, but for now, I will just use this. I just wanted us to understand how these things has progressed right from the time of classical colonization through neocolonialism to the present and latest form of colonialism, which I call the meta-colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your reflections. I'm sure we'll come back and discuss lengthily about that during the Q&A part of this session. I'd like now to introduce the third speaker for today. Gagnet is an undergraduate student at the African Leadership University in Kigali studying global challenges. She also works at the digital content creator at Baobab Consulting, a social impact firm offering services in strategic communications, counsel, and research. She's interested in the collision of digital cultures, policy, and governance, and is also an essayist who writes with a precise eye on digital inequalities and women's and girls' rights online. She's currently writing the undergraduate dissertation on the influence of online violence on Kenyan women's participation on Twitter. So please welcome Gagnet.
Hi. So I didn't expect to read my whole bio, but okay. So first of all, before I get into my opinion of the topic, just to define a colonial relationship. So I define a colonial relationship as one that is hierarchical, extractive, and exploitative, and one that produces uneven consequences. Yes, one that produces uneven consequences. And so when you break this down and you look at the question of whether technological development will necessarily result in a better Africa, you realize that we do have a colonial relationship with technology right now. And when you break it down, when you look at the hierarchy, so currently the relationship between technology companies and Africa is hierarchical, whereas Western ideas of tech disruption are seen as the universal. Like even when you're talking to startup owners and innovators in African cities, they're always talking about the standard of Silicon Valley, just looking at Silicon Valley as the standard that they want to achieve. And that fast growth model is what people look at as the idea of success. And given that also this ecosystem that we look at as an idea of success is foreign, it means that even on the continent, this tech ecosystem mostly benefits foreign Westerners. Then the Guardian and the founders said received funding of over $1 million in Kenya were white-led or had white co-founders, because the idea of success is the Western ideal. And when you look at the extractive side of this, because looking at the colonial relationship as an extractive one, our relationship with the tech industry right now is definitely extractive. And two ways we can point this out, or actually three ways: the minerals, the labor, and the knowledge and the skills. When you look at the knowledge, we find that solutions that are, when you look at the mineral scene, you find that a company like Apple today reached 2 trillion US market cap, and they get their minerals from Congo. So what does this $2 trillion mean to that Congolese person who's extracting coltan for the iPhone? Our iPhones run on coltan, yet the Congolese people do not see any of this money, most of the people in those mines are children, right? Apple hasn't talked about any plans of making their supply chain less extractive, and that's just one way we can look at it. And when you look at the labor side of things, you see how big tech companies outsource most of the heavier tasks like content moderation to people in countries like the Philippines, where the labor laws are weaker, and so they get to pay less and they don't pay for these workers' benefits. And also just looking at even with the gig economy industry, where companies like Uber and Lyft prefer to have contractors rather than employees because they pay them less, right? And don't give them benefits, and they're actually in court fighting for this. That is a very extractive mode of working, and they actually defend it. And when you look at knowledge and skills, with the user experience research and design that is embedded in a lot of tech companies' work, you consult the users about the features of your product, but then you don't give them accreditation for co-creating the product. And that's just one way of which it is extractive. You're extracting from users, but not acknowledging them. You're not paying them for their work. And also even features like reporting harassment on social media platforms. You find that as a victim of online violence, you have to report the violence yourself, which absolves the companies of most of the content moderation work and giving the victim responsibility of finding the measures when they're harassed online. And another side of this colonial relationship is the exploitative bit. I'm just going to focus on how, again, content moderators, and this is content moderators are not really talked about in the tech industry, right? They're the ghost workers of the tech industry. While a lot of the work is attributed to artificial intelligence, yet even for artificial intelligence to get to the level where it is right now, there are people who have to do the tagging of the data and the images, but these people are not credited for their work. They're not visible. They're from countries where the labor laws are weak solely because it's cheaper to hire from a country like the Philippines, right? And lastly, the uneven consequences of a colonial relationship, right? We see that with big tech companies again, where a company like Facebook will not take responsibility for elections in Kenya being interfered with using the data that they extract from people from Kenya. And so I know of a researcher who says it's not even uneven consequences, these or unintended consequences of technology. These are more of blind spots, right? Because people who work in tech look a certain way. They're mostly white. They're mostly white and male, and so this means that there's a huge blind spot of people who are from the global south, people who are women, people who are queer, people who have disabilities. So these are all unintended consequences of, or rather, blind spots of technology. And so when you put all this together, it shows that our relationship, especially as the African continent with technology, is definitely a colonial one, with us being the colonized and the technology companies being the colonizers, and also just looking at how a small group of people, primarily in Silicon Valley, are able to deploy technologies that change human lives in like the whole world. So yeah, it just shows the colonial relationship between Africa and tech companies, especially ones in the Silicon Valley.
Thank you very much, Garnet, for that reflection. So just in case we have an image, actually, I can show an image of one thing that she was mentioning, which is this list of top CEOs of top startups in Kenya who appear to be majority or entirely white in this, at least according to this collation. I also really appreciate, I think, the pointing out how a lot of work that goes beyond like making our Instagram and Facebook profiles look nice is being done like in the so-called developing world in conditions that are less than ideal. We have one last speaker, but before, so if you already have questions, you can start posting them in the chat. We'll come to that. Alice will come to those after the last speaker. Who is Tola? Are you ready? So Adetola, Adetola is studying a master in law at Cambridge University and is from Nigeria.
Okay, I'm not studying in Cambridge. I graduated a while back.
Okay.
I'm the chief negotiator for the Nigerian government. All right, so thank you so much for this platform. Thanks to the organizers for this important conversation. I'm just going to try to flag through a range of things in the next few seconds as regards information technology and tech. And I say this very fondly because this is one of the places where I built my career. So it's very interesting to have to speak about this. Is information technology colonialism for Africa? I think the answer is very complicated, right? There are points that say it is, but there are points that also show you very strongly that it just might not be. And so what I'll try to do is take you through in the next 10 minutes, succinct points that argue on both sides, that try to show you that it might be and it might not be. On the side of saying it's colonialism, I'll touch on 4 major points. The first is the issues of funding. The second is the issue of investor preferences. The third is the issue of technology designs. And the last is the issue of platforms and tributes. So let's start with funding. The truth of the matter is that, and I think Ghana did a fantastic job of saying that in a lot of African countries, it is And even in tech globally, it's a lot easier for a white founder to raise capital in any part of the world than it is for a Black founder. So there's a general popular statistics about how 70% of the founders of startups in Kenya that have received over $1 million in 2018 were actually led by white expatriate founders. And to make it more interesting, expatriates only constituted about 0.15% of the entire population of Kenya. So it basically means 0.15% was able to earn 70% of the foreign capital that came into tech in that country. More interestingly, even when you look at the US, 76% of VC investment went to white-led companies. So it's not just an issue of Black founders in Africa, it's also an issue of Black founders when they're outside of Africa. To make the issue more interesting, when you break down that 70% of white founders who raised capital in Kenya, 65% of them were from the US, 35% of them were from the UK, Italy, Denmark, and Germany. So not even non-Kenyan Africans. It was basically Europeans entirely. To make it more interesting, 65% of those expatriate founders had never lived in Kenya when they raised the capital. So they basically moved into Kenya, and in less than 0 years of moving to Kenya, they raised capital. That's very interesting, right? When you're trying to raise capital to solve a local problem. Now let's get it a little more interesting beyond even expatriate founders. The truth is, in the first quarter of this year alone, the data says that African tech startups have raised about $368 million, right? And almost all of that capital actually has come from the US or the UK, right? And now let me tell you what that makes interesting. I said this because it's something I have to do on a day-to-day. When you have to raise capital from the US or from Silicon Valley, from the UK or Netherlands, most of them would ask you to change your company to an American company, mostly because they want a security for their investments. And so what that means to a great extent is that you're raising capital, you're doing work in Nigeria, you're doing work in Kenya, you're doing work in Uganda, you're earning all this revenue, but in the end of it, you're a US-based company, you're a US-owned company, or you're a UK-owned company. And a very popular example of it is what happened with Jumia. We all know the Jumia story, where the big African startup listed on the IPO'd, and then suddenly everyone realized the founders, the ownership, everything was foreign owned. And that is another big issue, right? So it means that a lot of our silicons in the tech term means companies that are worth more than $1 million. A lot of those tech companies would automatically not be African businesses when they IPO, because their ownership and the investors that invest in them are actually non-African. Now, to make it a little more interesting, I'll talk a bit also of the issue of capital to actually compete. So I've talked about funding preference, I've talked about investment, capital to also compete. Now, I was just reading today that apparently Amazon is expanding massively even in India, right? And so Amazon wants to talk about the Indian market, and they're coming up against the 6th richest man in the world, Mukesh Ambani, who is just raised capital from Google and Facebook to actually take on Amazon. So the truth is, it's basically US money taking on US money to take on the Indian market, right? So, and that is India, and this is the 6th richest man in the world. So the truth is, and that is a place where the 6th richest man in the world is putting his money where his mouth is. How many of that same scenarios would you find in Africa? I think you can mention a number of big tech startups and big tech billionaires that are investing in Africa and that are driving things in Africa who are Africans, maybe Stripe, Masiawa, a number of them. But the truth is, there are not a lot of them in the scheme of things. So it means that a big range of, so imagine you can raise that $20 billion to match Amazon in its spread. It means to a great extent that Amazon or whatever market will take over your market. And there's a popular phrase that India is the market that the West wants now, and the last frontier will be Africa. So the question becomes, if the biggest unicorns from Africa will be US owned, if the biggest funding is coming from the US, to what extent can we really say that African startups can compete? The last thing I'll talk about on the side of colonialism is the issue of new platform ownership. The truth is, if you're creating a mobile app today, the two biggest markets you can list on is either Apple or Google. That's the end. And the truth is, so the platform ownership in itself, and just the issue of the TikTok happening recently shows you in the strong sense, the issue of platform ownership, in the sense that if you don't own the platform in itself, there's a problem. Because if you don't own the platform, the issue is that you can build, but you have to then subscribe to the standard. So for instance, if you list anything on Apple websites, 30% of your revenue goes to Apple, right? And that's one of the big issues where businesses like Fortnite are now taking on Apple, gaming companies are now taking on Apple to sue them for antitrust violations. But the truth is, as of today, those are the two places you have to list if you want. And that's why people like Huawei can be handicapped the moment the US turns against them, because The truth is the biggest platforms for tech today are in the US. And that's mobile apps. Even when you get into the big cloud computing, the biggest companies in cloud computing are Amazon Web Services, Azure for Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, and IBM. Of all those five biggest companies, the only one which is not a US-based company is Alibaba, which is Chinese. And truth is, even with that, none of them is an African closed platform. Now, having said all this, and maybe the last thing to say is also technology design. The truth is, a big part of the technology that is designed as of today, we know it's the issues of AI bias against black skin, the issues of technology design that are not designed to understand black humor or black conversations. There's a lot of that. So the truth is, because the design is not done by Africans, a lot of technology in itself biased against Africans. But having said all this, I think it's important to also put some context to say that technology in itself, in the last few years, have been some of the most liberating things for Africans. One is that it's led to some of the biggest revolutions and biggest calls for action. It's one of the strongest places to call governments to big action. It's been one of the strongest places to hold governments accountable. It's one of the biggest revenue earner for the African continent. Some of the biggest new age billionaires and millionaires in Africa were actually minted from information technology itself. To make it more interesting, it's become one of that system where you can sidestep government. In fact, in Nigeria today, some of the biggest tech players actually came up out of the need to avoid government bureaucracy and government complications. So the truth of the matter is, all you find is that a lot of the big businesses in Africa that are making a lot of wealth, young Africans making a lot of wealth in Kenya, in Uganda, in Nigeria, in Egypt, are actually making a lot of wealth because of tech. And that's because that's one place where they can be nimble, when they can compete, and where the fact that they are young, agile, and intelligent actually allows them play well. So while it's easy to argue about the colonialism part, I think it's also important to balance it out to say, maybe it's not colonialism, maybe it's imperialism, maybe it's exploitation, maybe it's ownership of platforms. So the truth is that it's also created immense wealth. And you really can't blame a country if you don't invest in the startups. When the truth is, a big part of angel micro investing, a big part of VC investment that comes into Africa today comes from the West. The truth is, does that mean we don't have billionaires in Africa? No. If we want to talk of the IPO listing, for instance, the truth is, when you go to IPO listings, the truth is, a lot of African companies cannot list in their local stock markets. And the reason they can't list in the stock markets is because the markets are either not deep enough, the trading is not of the volume that they want. And because of that, what then happens is this. What happens is that it makes more sense to actually go list in the US and make more access to more capital than it makes sense to list in a shallow market. And also the fact is that a lot of African investors don't understand and used to brick and mortar investment. They don't understand the fact that technology is an asset and needs to be backed. The last thing I would say on this is that it's also an issue of the fact that the intellectual property framework in a lot of African countries are not deep enough. Because the truth is, IP is stronger when your IP systems are stronger. So meaning, if I can enforce, then it makes more sense for me to stay in that market. I think those are just my points to say, yes, it's easy to argue colonialism, but I think we should put it in proper context. That it's created strong wealth, it's created high standards, it's created revenue, it's allowed small businesses cross borders and expand, regardless of the orders and the complications of the bureaucracies of government. And so while it has its platform ownership problems of being owned by the West, which you can't really entirely blame the West for, the truth also is that you also have to take cognizance of the fact that African businesses, African billionaires, African governments have to create a more enabling business environment for tech to thrive and to be owned in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tola. That was a lot of information to think about, and we'll be discussing it now. But for that phase, I'll pass the mic to Alice.
Yeah. Thank you, Temi, and thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to our audience who have joined us today from around the world. It's been insightful and very, very engaging topic so far, and our speakers have been able to contribute to it immensely. Some taking stands and others leaving the topic open to us and showing what really is happening all over Africa in our relations to tech and tech advancement. I was expecting to see a lot of questions coming up right now from our participants. And so if you'd want to ask a question, kindly raise up your hand or show, and I would call you to ask our participants the questions or put up general questions altogether. I would personally want to ask Tola. Tola, you raise issues concerning the fact that technology has brought about wealth to Africa and making Africans, young Africans, rich. But my question is, what is the distribution of this wealth? Who are those benefiting from this wealth? Because when you talk about raising wealth, is that not entrenching existing disparities in inequalities in wealth acquisition then? Tola.
So thank you very much. And I think I can, and thank you for this question. I think you just allowed me to make one extra point. The truth of the matter is that, if anything, and that's what has made technology different from most other assets of making wealth in the last few years in Africa. If anything, technology has actually democratized wealth creation. So you see a lot of young individuals who don't come from wealth, don't come from connection, who are actually just intelligent. In fact, I know a particular person who just got one of the biggest tech investors on his board, invested just yesterday. And this is someone who dropped out of university. And so what's happened a number of times, a lot of them who are just by grit hard work. Because the thing is, when you look at technology assets, you can learn to code by yourself, you can learn to code on YouTube. And so what's happened is that, and when you solve a big problem using technology, what it does basically is it sidesteps the problem. So because when people do that, what happens is that then they can raise capital. And the tech ecosystem has in Africa generally has created this very easy border, easy access system where you almost can reach anybody in the tech ecosystem in 1 or 2 persons, right? And so what's happened basically is that a lot of young people who would not particularly come from wealth or don't particularly come from connections, don't particularly come from any of this kind of systems, learn the skills that they need to learn and then solve a real problem. And there are a lot of them, from InterSwitch to Andela to Flutterwave to Paystack to Cellulant. There are a lot of them who, to buy coins, we just raised capital recently, to Prep Class, to Farm Plus. There are a lot of them who are just young individuals who learn to code, solve the big problem, and then suddenly are raising a lot of revenue in series. So while things like maybe construction and things like buildings and the rest might actually entrench wealth, tech in Africa has actually allowed a lot of social mobility. So you have these individuals who didn't have wealth before, didn't have class before, suddenly beginning to list on the wealth platform because of technology.
Thank you very much, Tola. The next question will go to...
Can I say something?
Yes, Richmond, definitely. You can go ahead.
That is why I started by saying that the word information technology is very broad. And until you try to disaggregate what you are talking about, the issues, you may not be able to do justice to the issue. If you take, for example, what Tola makes a very insightful point, and your question is very valid. If you talk about technology and you're talking even about access to mobile phones, now the data shows that in Africa, more than 70% of the population own mobile phones, right? But then if you begin to look at the internet, then you look at it from even a spatial perspective, rural versus urban, male versus female, then you begin to see these disparities. So if we make the argument that yes, technology brings about the democratization of information, the ability of young people to be able to do fantastic stuff with data or with platforms and other things, then you begin to see who are these people who get access to that. As in, there are existing inequalities that, as David rightly mentioned, have been created by systems that have predated a very long time ago. And we seem not to have overhauled them. Those systems still exist at the background. And then there's this layer of technology, which in itself is good, as in, I'm not against technology. But until we sort of understand the existing disparities, inequalities, weaknesses, the fractures within society, we might not be able to sort of do justice to it. So it's a bit tempting when you use the word technology, as in you might be talking from like helping Africans to be able to raise capital and all that. But then if you begin to look at what component of technology you are talking about, then you begin to see these gross and very wide disparities. So that is one thing I just want our speakers to sort of avert their minds to, because these are very important, and I like the submissions coming from my co-panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richmond. So Ghana, you mentioned you're doing a research on Twitter and violence against women in Kenya. Can you, as we can see, even for our panelists, we have just yourself being the only woman here, and we would want to know the dynamics in as much as we are talking about the liberating effect of technology. what can you give us a reflection on the consequences of it on women participation in the entire tech industry as well?
Right. So I'm Kenyan, and something about the urban Kenyan youth is that we use social media a lot, especially when speaking to political powers, because channels offline are not as effective or as visible, right? And in the offline, we get arrested during protests. And so Kenya has a very vibrant digital space, and we saw how women used it in 2014 during the My Dress, My Choice movement, organizing protests on social media. And it's been like that. We have fundraised for Stella Nyanzi, the Ugandan professor who was arrested last year. We have agitated for new laws and all that. But it's also, in as much as it's a transformative political space for women, it's also a space where women are experiencing so much violence. I mean, you can be on Twitter and you post a picture. I can give an instance of 2 weeks ago, a woman posted a picture celebrating her 30th birthday. And so many people were in her comments talking about, why are you 30 and you don't have children? Your breasts are sagging, you know? And these were comments in the hundreds, not tens, but in the hundreds. And so what I'm finding out through research is that there are misogynistic groups on Twitter and Telegram, and they mostly use Telegram for organizing because it's a closed platform, and so no one can really moderate what goes on a platform like Telegram, right? And so you find that if you're a visible woman on Twitter, you get harassed, and it's very organized. And another instance is Kenya's first coronavirus patient. Her name is Brenda. When she was in the news after she recovered, giving her testimony of what it was like to be a COVID-19 patient. 2 days later, her nudes were leaked on social media, you know, and it became a thing where, it became a thing about her morality and not about the disease itself. And so while women are enjoying the affordances of social media, there's so much violence in this platform, especially a platform like Twitter that prides itself as a space for political conversations, you know, and female politicians in Kenya can't really speak out, or what they can, if you can just switch off on all the harassment you face. But it's also something that needs to be looked into by tech companies, and you find that they don't really address it as effectively, because when you look at research on online harassment, it's based on studies of Gamergate, which was a case in the US, right? And so there are very few studies on what happens on our side of the continent. Those small NGOs and human rights activists are putting out so much work. We're not seeing as much work on the tech company side, especially a company like Telegram, you know? And it's also the content moderation is not as effective on our side because content moderators are not from the continent, so they do not understand the nuance of being called a slut into Swahili. How do you moderate that, you know? Yeah, so it's just a really important thing.
Yeah, so the next question goes to David, but I would want to know the thoughts of our speakers on the issue of how social media has become sort of a tool for repression, where governments are kind of censoring and restraining popular uprising through social media. And David, what is your impression on this question from Simpewe, who wants to know how this agenda fits into the framework of colonization? And after him, the other speakers can give their broad impressions as well. David, to you. David, can you please unmute yourself?
Sorry, okay. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. So I think that question actually boils down to my opening when I said that we have always been colonized to date. It's just the tactics that have changed. Yeah. And even after the demise of classical colonization, neocolonialism still came in. where we have the elites who took over power, took over control of political and economic power. We are just mere representatives of the colonial masters. So for instance, even we see governments acting just exactly like the colonial masters on their own people, trying to exert the same kind of force that the colonial masters extortion. If we say that technology is trying to democratize a whole lot of information spread and all that, why would a government impose sanctions on its own people not to use a particular platform that allows people to air their own view? So that on its own is another form of internal colonization that people are reframing on themselves, right? So unless we begin to, I'm always against having some kind of gathering where we begin to just point out problems that are affecting Africa without providing solutions. I think the question should actually be, what is the way forward? How do we ensure that colonialism doesn't continue to change tactics from generation to generation? And that is where the point that Tola was raising about owning platform, being able to invest in these resources so that we can actually control technology ourselves. Donald Trump once said that if Africans should kind of upset US, that just one click, they cut off the internet and then we remain in darkness. That is because they control the power. They control what you're talking about, right? And then the last thing I just have to mention is about policy, government policy. You see that most times we actually hurt ourselves. Yeah, the colonial masters can take a bulk of the blame for what they've done in the past, but when you are fighting and you get struck down, you don't remain down. You have to rise up and fight back, right? You have to rise up and fight back. So governments own it for their own people to make policies that will not only encourage people to invest within their own community, within their own country, but to also make sure that the future generation do not have the same set of experience that past generations have had. People can make argument that lives are better as it is today compared to what it was. But like I said, the colonialism is just coming in different form. When the classical colonization started, people were given mere mirror, and they could look at themselves and say, what a magic is it? And for that mere mirror, you sold out your raw materials and everything you had, even your own brother during the slave trade. So for the fact that I'm able to get cars which I cannot produce, to use technological platforms which I have no access to, which I cannot even build on my own, it makes my life better, but I don't need to be carried away with that fact and then not look at the other tactics that has used to make it another form of colonization. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Richmond, what do you think about this question?
Well, I think that, as in David has touched upon one of the things I mentioned earlier, that if you are thinking about colonization, and I think Tola also said it's probably the framing of the word colonization or neocolonization. I agree to a large extent that perhaps colonization never went away. The different tactics is at play. And therefore, see, we don't have to miss the point in thinking that we have social media platforms that can allow us to say what we want. You can't say exactly what you want to say on Twitter. See, there are algorithms that there are certain things you say to be taken down. So you don't even have that. There isn't that exclusive democracy that we sort of think and we want to attribute to technology. As I said, this conversation is very nuanced, it's very interesting, and I don't think our aim is to sort of take a very definite position, but it's to be able to point out the very nuanced things that we often take for granted. So the point is, well, government are shutting down maybe platforms, not allowing people to air their views. Isn't that in itself a form of colonization? If you ask me, I'll say, yeah. I said, what is colonization? As in, if you are just looking at who the colonizer is, at some point in time, it was a white man traveling the seas and coming to Africa. But this time around, it's not a white man. It's your president. It's your local leader. It's even your SU president in Oxford pulling Azamati from the student union. As in, these are things that if you want to broaden the discussion, you can sort of weave them in and say that, hey, this thing we are talking about, it's not just at a country level. And that is why I started by also looking at, if you're thinking about colonization, who are we even colonizing? Is it just people? Is it just voices we are trying to repress? Is it innovations? Is it initiatives? Just as Tola said, there are certain things, as brilliant as you can be as an African, you still can rise up because of certain institutional barriers that have been put in place. Talking about platforms, Android and Apple. So these issues are very complicated. And for me, it's not just compelling to just say, oh, the government is, they are taking down platforms, they're not allowing people to say, and therefore we don't have form of democracy. We think that these tech platforms gives us democracy. They don't, as in they don't. There are a lot of things in there that doesn't make it an even landscape. Mm-hmm. So I particularly agree with David when he says that. I think enough talk about all the negativities, okay, so what can we do about this? And then we begin to see the kind of mountain we need to overcome, the kind of barrier that is before us. And you can better gauge what you can do and what your efforts are when you begin to disaggregate technology. If you keep using the word technology, you are saying everything, but you are saying nothing. So, but if you begin to break it down and you look at data, for me, that is what I'm currently working on. So that is why I'm very passionate about data. Mm-hmm. It's something that we take for granted, but that is what we produce. From the time you sleep, when you wake up, the first WhatsApp message you get, when you start jogging, you are data-fied. Yeah. That is how the technology companies see you. You are data. You are not a human being. And there are algorithms that profile you. So I think that we should begin to sort of see this and then see the agency we have. Yeah. What agency do we have now in this ecosystem? Yeah. Now, we don't want the exploitation. We want our innovators to be able to be rewarded with the copyrights. We want our innovators to also gain a foothold on the market space. What do we need to do? Is it regulations? As I showed you, if you look at general data protection, as an African countries are ranked among the weakest. There are a lot of international indices. And I'm not saying that these indices are objective. As in, it's just some scholars sit down and think that, okay, why do you even choose those indices? You can get indices where you can easily get the data and then you use that to self-validate whatever you want to say. There are other indices that, but just let's use those indices that so-called have been adopted and we all refer to them. But I just tell you that our borders are open. Our borders are open, not just to big tech giants, but even within us as a country, as in, there are several loopholes. And that is why we see what our governments are doing. That's what we see our students, leaders doing, and a wide range of things.
Thank you very much.
That is what I want to say.
Yeah, Richmond, thank you. Janet, you can speak now.
So I wanted to speak on the question of African governments and suppressing opinions and views on social media. So I'm East African, and I feel like this is the one space that East Africa can be used to understand this issue of government surveillance and control of social media. So we're seeing right now in Tanzania, you can't even talk about, it goes beyond politics at this point. It even goes to an issue of health, where in Tanzania right now, you can't even talk about coronavirus online or even the recent tremors and that happened because it's an act of, I think, it's against the law to talk about coronavirus on social media. So it even goes beyond political opinions. I think we're at a point where African governments are seeing that this is the last frontier for surveillance per se. It's the one space that they haven't really controlled as much. And we're, especially in East Africa, we're seeing more and more laws and we're seeing more and more human rights activists, queer activists being targeted by the state because of what they post on social media. As I said, I come from Kenya, and just the other day there were protests against police brutality, and the police used the hashtag human rights activists were using to mobilize a protest and infiltrated the protest and arrested most of the leaders of the protest. And that's just like a facet of how big tech is being used for government surveillance. But then one side we rarely talk about, and I think it's a bigger side, is the telecom company, our MTNs, our Safarikoms. So you find that this company cannot resist government as much as big tech companies. Twitter may take down a government page if it's spewing hate, but Safaricom may not refuse to turn off the internet if a president says, "Oh, I need the internet turned off," because they work under country laws. And so I think it even goes beyond talking about big tech. The bigger issue is telecom companies and what values they have, especially when it comes to internet shutdowns. We're seeing a lot of that in East Africa. And I think for the concept of free speech, I think on the concept of free speech online, I don't think it's wrong for big tech to take down a tweet or a Facebook post that harms another person. I think it all boils down to human rights and issues like racism and sexism. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And come to think of it, Langa is saying that one agency we have, I feel, is to band together more to increase our voice at the global stage. That is interesting to know, because as we were putting together this dialogues, our Facebook page was brought down or was reported, and we couldn't access it. And so that's interesting to know. How then do we, as we keep talking about our participation and how repressive these platforms are used. Tola, what is your opinion? What's your impression about this?
I think it's a very interesting question. So I noticed I have a lot of questions that have been asked of me. I don't know, I was also going to that at some point. But
you can respond to some of the questions you've seen on the chat.
All right. I'll just say one, two things that I rarely ever say online, but I'll say it. One of them is this. It's that tech is growing. Big tech is so big that they almost can rival governments, right? And the truth of the matter is that, and that's going to be that way for a while. I remember I was having a conversation with basically the CEO of Twitter, right? And then he said something. He said governments will keep trying to regulate us, but we're faster than governments, so we'll win eventually. And that's the truth, right? Because the truth is, while governments try to regulate big tech, the truth is they're fast. Government is built to be slow. The very nature of government is that government is supposed to give stability. So government takes its time. Government does consultations, engagements. They take our time, stakeholders. Tech in itself is fast. And so the truth of the matter is that as tech grows, we're going to find out that the last frontier is fintech and payments. The moment tech can take control of payments and don't need a fiat, the power of government over a lot of them will change, because the truth is, the moment there's WhatsApp money or Facebook money or Google money, whatever it is, the truth is, and they don't need to rely on the dollar, the truth is the conversation changes dramatically, right? I just want to put that out there. And so it's going to put that also in context of all these free speech conversations that we're having. I have conflicted opinions on it, right? Because a part of me feels that moderation online starts a process that you can't control, right? Because the truth is that when you start moderating, you moderate in the sense of your own morality or what you think is right and wrong, right? The problem, so for instance, people have issues of the elections. Should they take out false statements? Should they keep out? It gets very tricky because the moment you get on that part, it's hard. So I generally like to think that draw a line around issues of maybe child pornography, a number of those kind of things, but leave every other thing, right? It just gets very tricky otherwise. But the truth is, I don't have strong opinions either way. It's one of those issues where I like to say I don't have enough information, and my thinking about it is still evolving. But I'll just say a number of things to answer a lot of the questions that have been asked. One of the questions that I was asked is the issue of what should be done for more African billionaires to invest in information technology. Yeah. I think it's a lot of things. I think one, on the stock exchange part of it, I think a part of it is that we need to start have conversations around dual listings, right? We need to have conversations around people being able to list in African markets using the dollar. Because the truth is, a lot of African currencies are still rather weak. And so the truth is, if I raise in Naira, for instance, and the Naira loses 30% devaluation over a period of time, then I'm disadvantaged, right? So the truth is, we need stock market to start to have conversations around probably people listed in the stock market using the foreign currency. That's one conversation you might want to have. A second thing you might want to also have a conversation around is taking away some of the stringent rules. It's still very stringent to list in Africa. And for a market that is not that deep, it is just too stringent, right? We need to talk about how having easier systems to list, getting it faster. But the truth is, there's a lot of rise of micro investment. I think a lot of that, what needs to be done in that part is education, right? Because what happens is that it's not that big billionaires are not investing. The Dangote refinery is one of the biggest investments in Africa in the last few years. But the truth is that it's that they like brick and mortar because they feel like if it goes bust, they've got real assets that they can sell, as against information technology where it's just but truly the market is changing. For instance, American Express is spending a lot of money just to buy the tech of cabbage. So the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of tech-backed investment that is being done. And I think a lot of sensitizations just have to be done to explain to African tech people. And a lot of that can even start with micro investment. Because what we need to see is we need to see a lot of more micro angel investors, a lot of angel. And so one of the things myself and a friend, Future Africa is doing with Future Africa Fund is that there's a rolling fund where people can pull together small costs so that you can then own bigger business. Because the truth is, what needs to happen is that when we have 1, 2, 3 big exits, where someone puts in $100,000 and does a big X10 exit or X20 exit, then there's a lot more case to make for people to invest in infotech. On the second question of how would I describe the Nigerian socio-political environment for the flourishing of hardware tech firms, being that right now Nigeria has one of the least per capita income? The truth of the matter is that Nigeria is one of those interesting markets. I say this, I don't have data to back it, but I say that the Nigerian market does not have the rich, the middle class and the poor. We have the lower middle class, and the lower poor class, the middle low class, the higher poor class. It's so broken down on wealth. It's so broken down, right? And why that's important is this. It's important because there's a concept of what I call daily money, which means that people don't have a lot of bulk cash, but they make money on a daily basis. So the bus conductor, the woman who trades every day, so she doesn't have a lot of cash, but she can buy Globacom credits or MTN credits every other day. But if you tell her to bring $1,000 Naira or 2,000 Naira to go, she doesn't have it. And so what that means is that it's a design question. And in tech, we'll call it a design question, which means that tech people and people that design solutions must start to design around Africa, right? Design for things that actually go to that market, not a broad type, big type, oh, this is what is done in the US, what is done in the UK. But hey, so for instance, I'll give you an example. And that's one of the things that Andela did well. What did Andela do? Andela simply said, listen, Africans can't pay to learn tech skills. Can I train them and then deploy them myself? So you need those kind of more African grown solutions. And I'll say one big thought around this. I know you're trying to nudge me to wrap this up, but I'll say one big thought around this. Myself and a friend were talking once, and I said this: if the mobile phone was designed by an African, it would be different. The truth is, the mobile phone was designed by a Western person who has good education, who has good healthcare. So the truth is, what they wanted was things like stock, calculator. That made sense. And my argument is that if an African was the one that designed the mobile phone, it will have an health app. It will have an accommodation app. Because the truth is, that's some of it will have an education app built into the mobile phone. Because those are some of our biggest, most fundamental problems. And so the truth is that also goes to that issue of platforms and designing for the biggest African problems. That if we start to think of it in that way, then the way we design and approach some problems will actually change. The last thing I would say, which is the last question I think I've been asked, I'm just trying to ensure I touch everything. All right, yeah. The last question I would say, which is this question of, Tola, David mentioned, and correctly so, that Africa seems to be living in borrowed comfort. Do you think that the local indigenization of tech development in Africa, independent global North capitalization is possible today? It's going to be hard, but it's possible. So I think, and this is what I think what needs to happen first is people need to start in small bounds, right? So what needs to happen is that people need to start to solve some of the most important problems and then start to aggregate those solutions. So what if someone solved the education problem? For instance, instead of schools, and that's one thing I say, instead of big schools, we can't afford to fund education the way it was done in the West, where you build schools. What if we created, the way we have Zoom meetings now, created platforms where you can use tech to scale education at a great scale? So the truth of the matter is that, so what if someone solved that, and then someone else solved the health issue using tech? For instance, there's the studies that says that 65% of those that goes for healthcare in Lagos go for primary healthcare. So meaning that if I set up an application, I can solve 65% of the healthcare problems, and they go. So the truth is, what if I had to solve this kind of problem? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Tola. I would ask a few people to personally ask their questions. I'll ask Agbo to go first. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question? You can direct it to a particular speaker or broadly to the speakers.
Oh, okay, thank you very much, moderator. I think Tola has touched on some of the questions that I wanted to ask, but I want to also chip in another question to David. David, how would you describe the socio-cultural, some of the socio-cultural nuances that affect Africans buying autochthonous African products? Do you think that Africans will be willing to buy things that are made in Africa?
Thank you. David, let me take the rest of the questions and you can answer Agbo. Thank you very much, Agbo. Fabrice, I saw you raise an interesting question and I would want you to ask that question yourself. Can you please unmute yourself to talk?
Yeah, so I've been listening to the conversations and a lot of very interesting points are being raised, and the conversation has been very engaging. So the focus or the title of the talk was on colonization, IT being the new neocolonialism. Based on the conversation then, I was thinking, should we also kind of extend that to actually, instead of it being to aimed at colonialism, should it actually be on what are we doing, what are different African states doing to prevent this process from continuing, rather than always being something that's kind of looked at a thing where, oh, the others or the West is attacking Africa. So what are African states doing in terms of education? What is being what structures are being put in place to make sure that the new generation are conscious about all of these developments that are going on in the world, and so that in the future there can actually be kids from Africa that develop these platforms, and also what our government's doing to encourage people from Africa to invest in technology, and also people from the diaspora to invest in Africa.
Thank you, Fabrice. It's interesting you raised the issue of agency and what our government in particular are doing to create an enabling environment for investment. I'll take my third question from V. V, can you please ask your question?
Thank you for the opportunity. I just had a small question to David. So currently, the issue of slavery reparations it is one of the most divisive issues, especially right now in American politics. For example, polls show that while about 75% of Black Americans are for reparations, over 80% of whites are not. And yet reparations are supposed to free the kind of wealth that is necessary for investment to happen in the key sectors in Africa. So do you think that reparations are one of the solutions that we should pursue? And if it is one of the solutions that we should pursue, how much is enough to account for the losses that we have faced over all these years? Thank you.
Thank you very much, V. So I would ask the speakers to address the questions. And in addressing the question, I would ask them to more or less summarize what they think would be the way forward on this topic, so that today doesn't end up being just deliberating on whether it's an issue of colonialism or not, but actually denigrating steps forward to changing the scenes as it is today. So David, the first question was for you, and would like to know your impression and your answer to the question. Then the other speakers can do, followed by Richmond, Garnet, and Tola.
Yeah, thank you for that question, for those excellent questions. And I think probably, to be honest, all these questions, my answers are probably gonna connect each and every one of them. But before then, there was something that Tola mentioned about, for instance, listing dollar on Nigerian stock exchange, for instance, for Nigerians. I think the problem that we usually have is that we tend to always follow the easy way of doing things. If, for instance, there is an option, but that option is difficult, even though at the end is going to be more promising, an average Nigerian, an average African would rather take the easy way. For instance, if we list dollar on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, we know that the value for dollar has something to do with the demand for it. That will mean that there will be lesser demand for Naira, and that will even go ahead to devalue Naira the more. So we are just killing ourselves by still promoting those colonial acts. So that being said, the question about the socio-cultural African thing and the ability of an average Africa to buy made in Africa, we actually had a solution to that because we understand the problem and we knew where the problem started. The problem started during the classical colonization when the Europeans came and made us feel that they were superior to us while we were inferior. So I grew up during my social science in primary school. I was told how Mongo Park discovered River Niger. That was just at my backyard. It took a white man to fly seas and then come to tell me that a river that was just in my backyard, he discovered it, a river that has been there. So I believe the white man, I believe the Europeans, and I take them more authentic than my fellow Blacks. That's a problem on this earth, which is the reason if someone is coming from Cambridge, they will say that you have the best knowledge from the best people, from the people they appreciate. I think that simply means that we ourselves, who has been opportune to be in Cambridge, be in Oxford, and top university of the world, owe it to our own country, actually, to proffer solutions to these things. Because part of the reason why, if you go back home, you agree with me that if you go back home, the way they see you is not the same way they see someone else who went to the best university in your country. So that means you have that advantage of how they see the Europeans, and you are in a better position to start producing things that could be championed as made in Africa. Okay, I'm doing my bit. For instance, I will give you a typical example of what I am doing, which is what—
a few minutes to wrap up, so.
All right, which is what the next question that I think it was Uchechuku asked, what we are going to be doing. We need to take, we need to stop blaming other people. We need to take responsibility and then proffer solutions for our own thing. We need to groom Africans. I have a tech platform that I'm trying to build. Nothing stops me from kind of taking a whole lot of people from Cambridge here to do that. But for over 8 months, I have been trying to get people in Nigeria who have some skills, and then I could support them, train them, and bring them up and bring them on the platform to be co-founders of that. It's taking me a long time, but I'm sure I'm going to get there. So the onus lies on us to actually take the initiatives and take advantage of us being here to proffer solutions to most of these problems back home.
Thank you very much, David, for re-echoing that the onus lie on us to take up what the challenge that has been posed to us as students of Oxford and Cambridge. And Richmond, up to you to give us to summarize your impression on this and what is the way forward for us. Unmute yourself, Richmond. Thank you.
Yeah, I share a lot of the things David has said, and those were my cogitations this morning when I woke up. As in, what does it mean for me to be a postdoctoral researcher in Cambridge, and what advantage does it give me when I go back home? So it's very instructive. He mentions that you should be able to use that to be able to address some of the things, the privilege that has been given us, as in not everyone gets such a standing. So it's good he mentioned that. But I think Fabrice's point is something that I think that is important for us to think about it. And Tola has adequately elaborated on this. We are already steeped in information technology. Just as he said, the current governance system, as we have it, is configured in a way that takes time. as in it grinds very slowly. We need to understand things, experts need to meet, we need to discuss. So it doesn't rally as fast as tech. You see, tech is about risk taking. It's the highest form of risk. And that is why they have huge investment, that risk investment relationship. That is not how government is designed to be stable, as Tola mentioned. And that will mean that we need to sort of start educating people. For me, that is my motive now. And that is why I see my career shaping up. What do you even know about this economy, that is this digital economy? And what is your role in that? Because until you understand what you are, people to themselves, oh, it's nice to just take a picture. It's just nice to geotag. I've been to Brussels and all that. No, it's not just enough. You need to know your data rights. You need to understand that you've got the rights to tell even your government that I don't want you to capture this information about me. Pull it down. We need to raise generations who understand this landscape. It is a new era we've moved into. So we can't keep talking about things we were talking about in the industrial age. We are in a new age, an age where things are done differently. We need to educate people so that their knowledge is consistent with what is happening. And that in itself will take time, because we haven't also built the institutions that will sort of help, but it needs to be done. As in, if it needs to even start from the grassroots, it still needs to be done. One thing I want to emphasize, and this is very evident in the data I showed you. When we talk about tech, our mindset is always averse to cities, and that is what I study. Africa is not about our cities. As in a chunk of, we are all moving, population is gradually gravitating towards cities. But the real issue, when COVID-19 struck, that is, you begin to see the essence of our rural areas. Education, food, transportation. Let's avert our minds to this aspect and begin to see, if we still heavily rely on agriculture, what can we do for our agricultural sector? What technologies can we? So let's begin to think about these things. And let me just end on this. Just as Tola mentioned, if it were a Black person who designed the phone, you probably would have added some apps that thinks about housing. And that is very true. Let's endogenize technology. As in, we currently know enough. We know something. As in, let's begin to build apps that is designed for the African. Yeah. And that is what I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richmond. So I'll go to Garnet for your last submission and your concluding.
Sorry, I lost you. Can you hear me?
Alice, you are muted.
Could I raise a point in based on what Richmond just said quickly, please?
Okay, fine.
So my background is in molecular and cellular biology, and I work in next generation sequencing. And it's a technology that's used to sequence the genome of people. And it's a technology that's growing. It's already well established in the West and in China, and it's starting to go into Africa and growing in Africa. So this conversation is actually interesting because having a data protection infrastructure is actually very, very important with these kind of technologies, because if the data of a whole population, if the data of a whole population goes into the wrong hand, you can, for example, develop an infectious disease that can wipe out a whole population. So this is why I think this is very important in that we're talking about governments being slow, but this time when it comes to technology, especially when it comes to medical, the healthcare sector, you can't be slow. It has to be something that's a lot of importance has to be given to it. That's just the point I wanted to raise.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fabrice. So we now go to Garnet. Garnet, can you please submit your remarks and what you think is the way forward?
So I come into this conversation from a governance and policy and human rights side. And so just to close up, I will address the question on what are Africans doing in terms of structures to catch up with like the tech revolution. And I think for me, I believe that African politicians know the power of tech. they are aware of it. It's not like they do not know it. They're aware of it. And that's why they're weaponizing it by not having data protection laws, because that makes them able to use companies like Cambridge Analytica, or they can surveil the internet, or they can bring in facial recognition technologies from companies like Huawei. And so the fact that they know this and that they're weaponizing this against Africans is quite worrying for me. And Langa in the comments said we need to raise our voice on the global stage. And I do think it's really important right now for Africans to speak to their governments on these issues. But then again, all hope is not lost, I think. For me, one great example of a government in Africa that's using tech for the good of its people and not for the good of not for the role of oppression is the Rwandan government. So the Rwandan government is creating an enabling environment for tech by changing their reliance from relying on agriculture to relying on information technology. They want to create a knowledge-based economy. And so they're talking to both big tech companies and African companies like Andela. We already have Andela in Kigali. We have Moringa in Kigali. We have the government using tech in health heavily. We're seeing drone technology used to deliver blood to areas that do not even have roads yet, and seeing a country like Rwanda prioritize their people is quite hopeful for me. And just having leaders who think of us, and especially now since Europe already has their paper on ethics and guidelines on AI use. Why do we not have that yet? And so just thinking about that, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Garland, for your concluding remarks. I will now ask Tola to also speak, and probably if he has any questions that he hasn't answered, he can go ahead and answer those questions. Just like 2 minutes, Tola. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a number of things to say. I think one, and I'm responding to everybody now. When I say everybody, I mean David, Richmond. I think the answer lies in taking a lot more responsibility, right? I find that one of the biggest difficulties with academics and intellectuals is that we like to theorize. So we like to say, this doesn't work, it's bad, it's defective, but we spend less time being practical about coming up with reasoned, seasoned answers that work. So for instance, I'll give an example of the issue of raising capital in stock exchanges, right? The truth is, the reason why the currencies are getting devalued is not fundamentally because of money that is being raised abroad. Because the truth is, what will happen is that the companies will just go list in the US and raise in the US, straightforward, right? It's more of an issue of the fact that the governments are not dealing with inflationary issues the way they should deal with inflationary issues and have poor fiscal policy. That's the end, right? And the truth is, and I think the China model shows you a very clear example, which is that you can take the West system, fine-tune it to what you want, take out the best parts of it, and then leave the rest of it. And I think that's more of what I think I need Africans think. I think Africans thinking, I need us, a mentor of mine used to say, learn the rules to the extent where you can bend it without breaking it, and then use that to make change. And I think that's what I think we need more Africans to do. We need more Africans understanding the rules at play, understanding the incentives, aligning incentives. So for instance, questions is, why are African big investors not investing in tech? Why are tech businesses listing abroad? Why are tech businesses raising capital from the US and the UK and not Nigeria or Africa? Those are the questions we need to be asking, and then trying to create a system that solves that. The truth is, people follow what looks like it's the best for them in the market. People don't just say, oh, I want to patriotic, I'm going to destroy my business. That's not what happens. People will pick lines that favor them the most. So you want to answer those questions. For instance, you might say it's not stock market. We're just going to create a new system where people can, for instance, just sorting out the intellectual property issues alone gives a lot more reassurance for people to want to invest in Africa. For instance, till recently, a lot of African investors, even foreign investors and foreign businesses were set up in Mauritius, till Mauritius started having a more stringent system, and then people started moving their capital out. So that's some of the things we need to start to think about. Why is things that way? That's one. Two is, I think what needs to also happen is this, and this is probably the most important part. We need to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Why are these platforms structured in this way? The truth is, capital is lopsided against us historically. Fact. But the truth is, the question we're asking ourselves is, given where we are today, what can we do differently? How can we create platforms that we, for instance, how can we build the education platforms? How can we do what people like Andela did with the tech ecosystem? And those are the kind of questions we need to be asking and designing systems. So it's enough to say, it's not enough to say, oh, it's colonial, it's imperialist, it's not good enough. The real question, and that's why some of the things, and I talked about the Future Africa Fund, right? Where what we're doing is we're aggregating micro angel investors. We're saying over the last few years have been able to identify businesses that have great returns, and we've invested in them. Can we allow micro investors who are writing checks of $5K, $10K to aggregate into syndicates where they can then invest in Nigeria, in African founders? And those are kind of, and there's a lot of big success we're already seeing with a lot of startups. So the truth is, that's the kind of questions we need to be having. And that's kind of things I'm already doing. And I think that's what we should focus a lot of our energies.
Thank you, Tola. Thank you to all our audience and our speakers. It's been such an engaging session, and it's so sad that we've run out of time, actually. So I'll now ask Temi to give us his remarks for the section and probably conclude. Temi, you are.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you to all the speakers. So as we imagine, technology is a very broad field, and as Richmond said, any statement that does not disaggregate on this concept will be limited in scope and should be avoided. Nevertheless, I need to start by doing just that. So I think I've got on two major ways of looking at technology during this conversation. One is as a tool, and the second is what I would say almost as a country. So tech companies like Facebook, Microsoft, maybe Amazon, Alibaba, are bigger than many countries. They determine the value of our money, of our time, of our images, of our labor, like Guy Knight highlighted. So we might as well think of them as countries. The problem is that they are white countries. So they move capital abroad, extract profits, send colonial officers, and use expatriate settlers in a way that can remind us a bit of what was happening 2 or 3 centuries back.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah.
We also need to be worried. We also need to be aware along this skepticism that technology is also a powerful tool that is liberating many Africans, both politically and economically. Tola and Garnet have mentioned a few examples of this. So thank you again to all the speakers, also because they kind of almost on their own accord moved to considering what can be done about it. So this dialogue is not so much to say what is the situation, but to try to gather ideas of how we can address the situation. So again, thank you to all the contributors, to all those who asked questions, made comments, and I'll pass the mic back to Alice to close the series.
Yeah, thank you very much, Temi, for making us think about tech as a country and how tech innovation draws in different aspects and the perspective and conceptualizations that we can use. So I'm concluding the entire series that we have had so far. We began on the topic of this house believes that past and present African scholars at Oxbridge have been able to move beyond the rhetoric of change on the continent. We went ahead to discuss this house believes that abolition, not reform, will dismantle systems of racializing policy. And the third was this house believes that Africans are indifferent to racism in the diaspora. And this is our last and final session for the Africa Oxbridge Dialogues 2020, which was born not long ago with the coordination of 8 of us from University of Oxford and University of Cambridge. I would say thank you to Cynthia Okeye, Yinka Kusimensa, Simpewe Stewart, Temitope Ajeye, sorry if I pronounce it wrongly, Julian Shenza, Stephen. I would also thank, and myself for being the brain behind this. And we thank you, all those who have participated in the 4 sessions or in just this one. And we are saying that this is just one of a number of other African Oxbridge dialogues. And we hope to broaden our scope in the issues that we'll be addressing. And the takeaway for today for myself is the agency, building institutions and education, indigenizing tech, as Richmond said, a willingness for government to take leadership in this issue of tech, as Kenneth proposed, and what Fabrice said, which goes very right in relation to COVID and how data and medicine cannot wait for government willingness across Africa. And I would end with what Tola said, shift in perspective and understanding the issue and raising critical questions. Thank you very much. And I'll end here saying have a good evening and all the best to all of us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. See you everyone soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Tola, don't forget to send me some of the dollars.
We'll talk. Plenty to talk, my brother.
Thank you.
Thanks, the organizers. Thank you so much, Emitokwe. Thank you.